The text arrived at 7:15 in the morning, neat as a folded napkin and twice as cruel. We had a seating mix-up on the yacht tonight. Embarrassing. We just do not have room anymore. Claire Bennett read it once, then again, then a third time, not because she had misunderstood it, but because some injuries deserved to be memorized in their original shape. The kitchen around her was full of harmless morning things. Pale light spilled across the marble counter. The kettle gave a soft hiss. A gull cried somewhere beyond the harbor, sharp and lonely in the cold Newport air. Adrian stood by the coffee machine in shirt sleeves, one hand around a ceramic mug, the other scrolling through overnight emails with the calm focus of a man who had spent his life solving problems before most people finished naming them. Claire crossed the room without a word and held out her phone. He took it. His eyes moved once across the screen. Nothing in his face broke. That was what made it worse. Not shock. Recognition. "What time?" he asked quietly. She swallowed. 8. His jaw tightened so slightly another person would have missed it. Claire did not. She had learned Adrian in the way people learn coastlines they trust, by repetition, by weather, by the subtle shift that meant a storm had changed direction. He set the phone down with deliberate care, as if it were something breakable or dangerous. Before that message, the day had been ordinary in the gentle, earned way only a Saturday morning could be. Claire had planned to spend the afternoon polishing a presentation for the Maritime Arts Council, a campaign she had built from scratch, a project about restoring visibility to fishing families the city loved to romanticize but rarely listen to. She had notes spread across the table. Taglines. Color drafts. A photograph of weathered hands hauling rope from dark water. All of it now looked distant, like work left behind in another life. We do not have room anymore. The words struck harder because they were dressed in silk. No accusation. No fight. Just erasure, wrapped in social grace. Her father had always preferred that kind of wound. Not loud. Not open. Clean. Deniable. Richard. Bennett was turning 68 that night, and apparently there was room on the yacht for Owen, for Vanessa, for family friends, for old donors from the sailing club, for people who knew exactly how to laugh at Richard's stories before he reached the end of them. There was simply no room for Claire. Not enough room on a vessel the size of a floating mansion. Not enough room in a life that had been crowded around her for decades without ever making space for her. She could already see Vanessa's hand in it. Vanessa, with her polished sympathy and velvet voice. Vanessa, who never pushed Claire out of the frame directly, only stepped in front of the lens and smiled while everyone else adjusted to the new composition. But even as that thought rose, another one came behind it, colder and more honest. Vanessa may have suggested it. Richard had still sent the message. Claire stared at the screen again. A memory surfaced fast and bright as broken glass. Her college awards banquet. Her father clasping Owen on the shoulder in the lobby, introducing him to strangers while Claire stood 10 feet away holding the certificate she had stayed awake nights to earn. Then another memory. Thanksgiving 3 years ago. Her place card missing from the formal table. A folding chair carried in from the study, set at the corner near the service door as if she had arrived unexpectedly to her own family. The same shape. Again and again. Invisible was not the right word for it, Claire thought. Invisible things were not noticed. She had been noticed. Measured. Repositioned. Softly lowered to the edge every time the room was arranged. Adrian was watching her now, not with pity, never that, but with the grave stillness of a man standing beside a locked door he already knew how to open. "Do you want to go?" he asked. Claire lifted her eyes. In them there was humiliation, yes, but beneath it something older had begun to move. Something that had spent years curled tight in silence and had finally uncrossed its arms. She thought of the harbor. The yacht. The polished guests. The seat that had disappeared. And then she thought of the detail Adrian had mentioned once, casually, months ago, a passing fact she had never needed until now. The Bennett celebration was docking at Harbor 9. Harbor 9 belonged to Adrian's world. Her father did not know that. Yes, Claire said. Outside, the wind came in off the water, thin and sharp enough to wake anything still sleeping. By the time Claire reached the bedroom, the house had gone so quiet it felt as if even the walls were listening. She stood in front of the open closet for a long moment without touching anything. Dresses hung in a row, soft and motionless, shadows layered in blue and charcoal and cream. Her fingers brushed past linen, silk, wool, then stopped at the deep navy dress she had worn the night she presented her rebranding campaign at the Maritime Arts Council Gala. It was not her most expensive dress, nor the newest, nor the kind that begged to be admired. That was why she chose it. It did not ask a room for permission. It entered and let the room adjust. She lifted it from the hanger and laid it on the bed. In the mirror across from her, morning light caught the side of her face and showed her a woman who looked composed from a distance and tired up close. Not weak. Never weak. Just worn thin in places no one had bothered to see. The first memory came while she fastened the dress. She was 22 again, standing beneath white event lights in a hotel ballroom in Providence, holding a writing fellowship plaque with both hands because it felt too important to risk dropping. She had searched the room for her father, pulse fluttering, wanting only one thing, a look, a smile, some unmistakable sign that he understood what this meant. Instead she found Richard near the bar, laughing with two men in tailored jackets while one hand rested proudly on Owen's shoulder. Owen had just closed his first small property deal, and Richard was telling the story as if the family name itself had struck gold. Claire had stood there in heels that pinched and a borrowed dress and watched her own achievement shrink in real time, not because it was small, but because the light had been turned elsewhere. Then came her wedding. Late summer. Salt in the air. White flowers trembling in glass bowls. She remembered moving from table to table with Adrian, smiling until her cheeks ached, while Richard sat deep in conversation with Vanessa and a circle of sailing club guests who all seemed fascinated by Owen's plans, Owen's instincts, Owen's future. There had been no scene. That was the pattern. Nothing brutal enough to name cleanly. Only little withdrawals. Little exclusions. Little editings of the emotional record until Claire herself began to wonder whether she was imagining the missing pieces. She sat at the edge of the bed and put on her shoes slowly. After her mother died, Richard's attention had changed shape. It narrowed. Hardened. Owen, already the eldest son, became the axis around which his father's pride organized itself. Owen was practical. Visible. Easy to present to the world. Claire had become the other child, the one who did well quietly, who recovered from disappointments without spectacle, who learned too early how to save other people the discomfort of her pain. Richard had mistaken that resilience for lesser need. Year after year, he had invested where the return looked obvious. Owen got expectation. Vanessa got access. Claire got the role of the daughter who would understand. Downstairs, she heard Adrian moving through the kitchen, measured and calm. A drawer opening. A glass set down. Then his voice, lower now, more formal. He was on the phone. Claire paused at the top of the stairs, one hand on the banister. Yes, 8 sharp, Adrian said. No announcement. Just have the private lounge ready if I ask for it. A beat of silence. Thank you, Helen. He ended the call before she came down, but she knew that tone. Efficient. Precise. Doors being unlatched in places most people never knew existed. They left just before dusk. The drive toward the harbor carried them through streets washed in cold Atlantic light, where flags snapped above old brick storefronts and the wind pressed the scent of salt and diesel through the narrow crack in Claire's window. Newport looked beautiful in the cruel, polished way rich coastal towns often did, every white porch and shining mast pretending life could be arranged neatly if a person had enough money and the right shoes. Claire watched the town slide past and said, I know Vanessa helped orchestrate this. Adrian kept his eyes on the road. Probably. She called him 3 times this week. Owen mentioned it without thinking. Another pause. The kind that made room for truth before speaking it. Then Adrian said, "It does not matter who proposed it. Your father still chose it." The words landed without mercy because they were exact. Claire turned toward the window. In the darkening glass she caught her own reflection layered over the harbor lights coming awake one by one. For years she had spent her energy interpreting, excusing, softening, translating every slight into something survivable. Tonight there was nothing left to translate. When they reached Harbor 9, the water lay black and restless beneath the rows of lights. At the far end of the private dock, Richard's chartered yacht gleamed like a floating promise, all polished railings and warm gold windows. Laughter drifted faintly across the water. Claire stepped out of the car and looked up. On the upper deck, beneath strings of soft lantern light, the dinner table had already been set. Silver flashed. Crystal glittered. And there, at the very end of the arrangement, slightly turned, clearly added after the fact, stood one extra chair. Different from the others. Narrower. Temporary. Her chair. For a second the whole harbor seemed to go still inside her chest. Then something colder than hurt settled into place. She had spent years trying not to notice the pattern. Tonight, someone had finally given it a shape she could point to. Claire and Adrian did not walk straight onto the dock. They stopped just beyond the pool of light cast by the harbor entrance, where the wind came harder off the water and turned every sound thin and metallic. From there, the yacht looked almost theatrical, its upper deck glowing against the black Atlantic like a stage built for people who had spent their lives believing they belonged at the center of every room. Laughter rose and scattered in the night air. Glass chimed. Someone called for more champagne. Claire could see them clearly. Richard sat at the head of the table in a dark blazer, one hand curved around a wineglass. His posture relaxed with the easy authority of a man who believed the evening had unfolded exactly as it should. Owen sat to his right, broad-shouldered, handsome, already carrying the guarded expression he wore in rooms where money and pride were being passed around in equal measure. Vanessa was turned slightly toward the group, one hand lifted as she spoke, her bracelets flashing each time she moved. Even from a distance Claire recognized the rhythm of her performance. Warm. Effortless. A woman who could make possession look like charm. For one dangerous moment, Claire wanted to leave. The thought came over her in a rush so swift it almost felt merciful. They could turn around now. Get back in the car. Drive somewhere anonymous with fogged windows and chipped plates and order clam chowder they did not need. Let the night collapse behind them. Let the people on the yacht go on believing their little story about who mattered and who did not. She could protect what was left of herself by refusing the scene entirely. Then Vanessa laughed and placed her hand over Richard's wrist, familiar, affectionate, perfectly timed. Richard smiled at her the way he used to smile at Claire's mother in photographs taken before the world split open and reorganized itself around loss. Something inside Claire went still. Not angry. Clear. No, she thought. Not tonight. Adrian glanced at her, reading the shift without asking. He had always known how to recognize silence when it changed temperature. Together they crossed the harbor entrance and stepped toward the private access gate. The reaction was immediate, though no one would have called it dramatic. A uniformed attendant near the security post straightened first. Then a young woman at the reception desk looked up from her tablet and rose so quickly her chair whispered backward over the floorboards. Further down the dock, a pair of deckhands unloading supplies paused just enough to glance over, then resumed with sharpened focus. Nothing theatrical. Nothing exaggerated. Just the unmistakable ripple that moves through a place when the person who actually matters has arrived. Claire felt it before she fully understood it. Then a woman in a tailored navy coat stepped out from the operations office and headed toward them with calm, efficient speed. Helen Ross. Harbor Director. Mid-50s, silver at her temples, posture like drawn steel. Claire had met her once at a charity auction and remembered the impression she had made, not warmth exactly, but competence so absolute it became its own form of grace. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," Helen said. Her voice carried just enough. On the upper deck, Vanessa stopped in the middle of a sentence. Owen's head turned next. His eyes moved from Helen to Adrian and then back again, fast, calculating, already assembling pieces that had never before belonged in the same picture. Richard was last. He looked up with the mild irritation of a host interrupted, saw Claire first, and then Adrian beside her, and then the way Helen stood before them, not as a hostess greeting guests, but as an executive receiving someone whose decisions shaped the harbor itself. For a heartbeat, the whole scene held. Richard rose halfway, confusion flickering across his face before the social smile hurried in to cover it. "Claire," he called. "You came after all." The words struck the air and fell flat. Helen turned slightly toward Adrian, her expression professional, composed, entirely free of curiosity. If she sensed the fracture running through the evening, she gave it no outward acknowledgement. She simply addressed the reality in front of her. "Mr. Cole," she said, "since this vessel is berthed under your executive access privileges, would you like us to clear the upper deck and prepare the private lounge for your party instead?" Silence. The harbor seemed to inhale. Claire watched the sentence hit them one by one. Vanessa went pale first, though her smile held for a second too long, thin and brittle now, as if it had been pinned into place. Owen's face changed more slowly. Not shock. Comprehension. The sober, hard kind. Claire could almost see the legal mind in him rearranging facts at speed, stripping appearances away until only structure remained. Richard looked from Helen to Adrian, then back toward the deck around him, as though the polished teak beneath his shoes had become suddenly unreliable. Helen continued, gentle and precise, giving form to the power no one at that table had imagined Claire carried beside her. "If you prefer, we can suspend service here and move your evening to the lounge immediately. Our staff is ready." No one on the yacht moved. No one spoke. And Claire, standing in the salt sharp wind with the black water shifting beside her and every gaze in that harbor turned toward the truth at last, felt something she had not felt in years. Not vindication. Not yet. Something quieter. The terrible, beautiful steadiness of no longer being the smallest person in the story. For one suspended second, no one on the yacht seemed able to breathe correctly. The wind moved first. It slid across the harbor in a cold silver sweep, stirring the water below and tugging at the edges of table linen on the upper deck. Candle flames shivered inside their glass cylinders. Somewhere below, a halyard struck a mast with a hollow metallic rhythm. The whole marina kept moving, yet the world around Richard Bennett's birthday table had locked into place so completely that even silence felt loud. Claire looked at her father. She had imagined this moment in a dozen crude, unfinished forms without ever admitting she had done so. In some versions he was furious. In others he was ashamed. In one petty corner of her heart, he was humiliated so completely he could never again say her name without tasting the cost of it. But what she saw on Richard's face was stranger than any of those things. It was uncertainty. Not guilt. Not yet. Guilt required a person to understand what they had done and why it mattered. This was earlier than guilt. Rawer. The first unstable instant in which a person realizes the story they have been telling themselves is about to collapse under its own weight. Richard stood beside the candlelit table with one hand still resting near his wineglass, but the pose no longer held. His authority had loosened. The polished ease he wore in social rooms had cracked along an invisible seam. Across from him, Vanessa sat very still, her spine straight, her mouth shaped into a smile that had lost all conviction. It was the smile of a woman trying to hold elegance together with fingertips. Owen had gone silent in the way men like him went silent only when the facts had become too sharp to talk over. Claire felt all of them seeing her differently at once. Not as the daughter who would smooth things over, not as the one who would understand, not as the soft place where carelessness could land without consequence. For the first time, they were looking at her as someone whose choices could alter the room. Helen waited with perfect composure, hands lightly folded in front of her coat. Behind her, 2 members of the harbor staff had paused near the gangway, attentive but discreet, ready to move the second a decision was made. Adrian said nothing. He did not step forward to claim the moment. He did not rescue it from her. He stood at Claire's side with the quiet stillness of a man who knew exactly how much power he had and had no need to perform a single ounce of it. "The decision is yours," his silence said. And that was when Claire understood the true shape of the night. Power was not in clearing the deck, power was not in making her father stand on the dock and explain to his guests why the evening had vanished around him, power was not in punishing Vanessa, or in watching Owen lower his eyes, or in forcing Richard to feel, in public, the same smallness he had taught her in private for years. She could do it. That was what changed everything. She could end this party with one sentence. She could let the staff dismantle the fiction in front of everyone who had come to celebrate him. She could take the upper deck, the better wine, the ocean view, the whole carefully staged birthday spectacle, and leave Richard with nothing but the sound of rigging clattering in the wind and the raw fact of his own choices. She could. Which meant she did not need to. Claire turned toward Helen. Her voice, when it came, was calm enough to cut. "No," she said. "It is my father's birthday. Let them keep their evening. Please show us to the private lounge." The effect was immediate and devastating. Richard blinked as if the sentence had struck him physically. Vanessa's shoulders shifted, not with relief, but with something much harder to bear. Relief would have allowed her to recover. This was worse. This was mercy. Owen exhaled once through his nose and looked away, his jaw tightening, because even he understood what had just happened. Claire had not been overpowered. Claire had spared them. And there is no humiliation quite like being spared by the person you had quietly dismissed. Richard found his voice first, though it came rougher than before. "Claire," he began, but the rest of the sentence failed somewhere behind his teeth. Whether he meant to apologize, explain, or simply reclaim control of the moment, Claire would never know. The chance passed too fast. She looked at him steadily. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said. "I hope it is a lovely evening." And to her own surprise, she meant it. Not because she wished to preserve his comfort. Not because she had folded back into old obedience. But because something deep inside her had finally shifted free. She no longer needed his evening to go badly in order for her own life to begin. Helen inclined her head once and stepped aside. "This way." Claire and Adrian followed her down the private corridor toward the harbor lounge. Behind them, the upper deck remained lit in golden glass and borrowed certainty, but the spell had broken. Claire could feel it without turning around. The guests would keep talking, yes. The wine would still be poured. The candles would still burn down in their glass sleeves. But nothing at that table would taste the same now. Not for Richard. Not for Owen. Not for Vanessa. Inside the private lounge, the world changed. The room was smaller than the deck above, warm and hushed, paneled and dark wood polished to a satin sheen. A low lamp glowed in one corner. Beyond the wide windows, the harbor stretched black and restless under the night sky, the lights of moored vessels trembling across the water like thoughts too fragile to hold. A round table had already been prepared. 2 place settings. Linen smooth as still water. Crystal waiting in patient silence. Adrian pulled out her chair. Claire sat, and as she did, a strange sensation moved through her, so unfamiliar it took a second to name. Peace. Not complete. Not healed. Not simple. But real. A server appeared with menus and water, efficient and almost soundless. Helen murmured that they should take all the time they needed, then withdrew, closing the door with a soft, respectful click. The silence that followed was different from the one outside. Not strained. Not brittle. Shelter, rather than suspense. For a few seconds, neither Claire nor Adrian spoke. Then Adrian reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. That was all. No speech about strength. No praise. No careful dissection of what had just happened. He knew better. Some moments became smaller the instant language touched them. So he left the moment intact and let his hand say what words would only dilute. Claire looked down at their joined hands, then out through the window to the dark harbor beyond. On the upper deck of the yacht, her father was still having his birthday dinner. The candles were still burning. The guests were still seated. The evening continued. So did she. And for the first time in her life, Claire Bennett understood that walking away from the wrong table was not a loss. It was an arrival. Owen called the next morning at 9:12, while Claire was standing barefoot in the kitchen, watching fog lift off the harbor in slow white ribbons beyond the window. Her phone buzzed once across the counter. His name lit the screen. For a moment she simply looked at it, struck by how strange a familiar thing could feel after one honest night. Owen had called her 1,000 times in their lives about practical things, holidays, schedules, errands, their father's moods, things that needed doing and things that needed smoothing over. He had almost never called her because he did not know where he stood. She answered on the second ring. "Claire," he said, and stopped. In the quiet behind his voice she could hear the sounds of his house. A cabinet closing. Coffee being poured. Vanessa moving somewhere out of range. He sounded tired, but not in the ordinary way. More like a man who had slept beside a question and woken up no closer to an answer. "I did not know," he said finally. "About Harbor 9. About Adrian." Claire leaned one hand against the counter. "I know." Another. Pause. Then, more carefully, "Did you plan that?" She could have answered in a dozen ways. She could have made him sit inside the discomfort a little longer. She could have let him wonder whether she and Adrian had orchestrated the whole thing, whether the night had been some elegant act of revenge years in the making. Part of her almost admired the symmetry of it. Instead, she gave him the truth. "No," she said. "Dad planned the whole thing." Silence opened on the line. Not empty silence. Working silence. The kind that changes shape while you are inside it. When Owen spoke again, his voice had lost something. Not pride exactly. Certainty. The easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life assuming the family story was at least mostly fair. Claire could hear him replaying the dinner in his head, stripping away the excuses, removing Vanessa's suggestions, removing logistics, removing embarrassment, until all that remained was the simplest fact of all. Richard had sent the message. Richard had made the choice. "Vanessa says it got out of hand," Owen said at last, and even he sounded unconvinced. Claire let the words settle and pass. "I am sure it did." He gave a short breath that almost became a laugh and then died before it reached one. "Claire, I do not think I have ever really seen it clearly before." Her throat tightened, not with triumph, but with grief for how long it had taken. "Neither had I," she said. Not all at once. They spoke for another few minutes, but the conversation had changed by then. It was no longer a negotiation on behalf of their father. No longer Owen trying to restore the furniture of the old family order before anyone noticed it was broken. They spoke like two people standing on either side of something newly visible, not repaired, not crossed, but at last named. When the call ended, Claire set the phone down and stood very still. Richard called that afternoon. He began with the weather. "It is colder today," he said, as though temperature might provide a bridge sturdy enough to carry him over what had happened. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Some patterns were almost tender in their predictability. "It is," she said. He cleared his throat. "About last night." There was some confusion with the guest list. Vanessa was coordinating with the charter team and Owen invited the Whitakers, and then there was a shuffle with the seating, and by the time I saw the final arrangement Claire listened without interrupting. His explanation was smooth in places, clumsy in others, stitched together from habit and self-protection. It distributed blame gently, generously, almost artistically. Vanessa. Timing. Numbers. Miscommunication. Logistics. The whole fragile architecture of a man trying not to stand alone beneath his own decision. When he ran out of words, the silence between them deepened. "I know you believe that version, Dad," Claire said softly. He went quiet. She could picture his face, the faint line that appeared between his brows when reality refused to cooperate with the shape he preferred. Claire had feared this silence for years. Now it no longer frightened her. It was only silence. Not a verdict. Not a weapon. "I love you," she said. "But I am not doing this anymore." The words did not rise. They did not shake. They landed with the clean weight of something forged slowly and carried a long time before being spoken aloud. On the other end of the line, Richard breathed in, then out. He did not apologize. Not truly. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps some people reached the edge of self-knowledge and stopped there, not because the truth was hidden, but because it demanded more surrender than they knew how to give. They ended the call gently. A week later, rain moved across Newport in long gray veils, brushing the windows with a soft, persistent hush. Claire sat at the kitchen table with her completed proposal open beside her, the final lines of her campaign catching the warm light from the pendant lamp overhead. She had written about fishing families, about people whose hands kept entire communities alive while their stories were pushed to the edges of brochures and speeches. People treated like background until someone needed authenticity for display. She understood the subject differently now. Across the room, Adrian stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, making dinner with the quiet concentration he gave to all things worth doing well. Garlic warmed in olive oil. Tomato softened into a rich red hush. Steam lifted and curled through the room. It was not a grand meal. It did not need to be. 2 plates waited on the small table by the window, set carefully, evenly, without ceremony and without omission. Claire looked at those 2 places and felt something inside her settle for good. No extra chair dragged in at the end.no place made provisional.no need to wonder whether she had been counted. Adrian turned and smiled when he caught her watching. "Dinner in 5, he said. Claire smiled back, then looked out at the harbor beyond the glass, where the lights trembled softly on the dark water and the evening gathered itself around the house like a blessing. For most of her life, she had mistaken endurance for love. She had believed that if she stayed gracious enough, useful enough, undemanding enough, one day someone would notice she had been standing at the edge of the frame all along and finally wave her in. But life did not work that way. Some doors never opened wider. Some tables never set a real place for you. And maturity was not learning how to tolerate that with prettier manners. Maturity was learning to leave with your dignity intact and build a life where your presence was never an afterthought. Claire reached for the proposal, closed it, and rose from her chair. This one was hers. Not because someone had remembered her. Because she had. If this story stayed with you, ask yourself one honest question. Is there still a place in your life where you are surviving on scraps of belonging when you deserve a full seat at the table? If there is, tell me in the comments. And if you believe the quietest payback is sometimes the strongest one, like this story, subscribe to Waters Payback, and come back for the next one.